So, Chauncey, there's been a narrative that started probably sometime on November 9th, that 2016, that what drove the very narrow win by Donald Trump. And just to remind everyone, not only did Donald Trump lose the popular vote, but he won by less than 70,000 votes spread out across 3 different states. I think everyone across the spectrum agrees that there were multiple but-fors, if you will, as to what brought about the loss by Hillary Clinton. They range really across the board, things that she had no control over, things that were, maybe nefarious, other things that were more banal in terms of, deficits in campaigning and deficits in policy, the nature of her as a candidate, et cetera, et cetera. We don't need to relitigate those things per se, but people want to know because people want to defeat Donald Trump, and people also want to know, what led to this real joker in many respects becoming the president of the United States. And I've spoken to people who basically have described that election as 2 people racing to lose the election. And it just so happened that Clinton got there first. And that may have changed if there was more time. But one of the narratives that came out of this was that there was something particularly, and part of that was because Trump won in Wisconsin by, maybe a dozen, 1,000, 10,000 or so votes. In Michigan, a similar number, between 7 and 15,000. And then in Pennsylvania, 40,000. States that are known as, purplish states with a white working class that supposedly defected from Obama to Trump. And the idea was that people were focusing on the working class part of that white working class as opposed to the white part of that white working class. This is a narrative that has been, repeated. And I think it's, there's a certain amount of motivated reasoning to it. But there's a new study out that, again, shows that, frankly, not the case. It's more the white stuff that's more operative.
Well, yes, there's so much excellent research at this point. And as you pointed out so sharply, the mainstream corporate media especially, but many Democrats, and I'll throw Bernie in there as well, are beholden to this lazy narrative about the quote-unquote white working class. It was working class anxiety. It was globalization. It was deindustrialization. Certainly those are factors which have devastated not just quote-unquote Rust Belt America, but inner city black and brown America. But we have a recent article called The Anger Games, Who Voted for Donald Trump in the 2016 Election and Why, which just appeared in the journal Critical Sociology, which is just another nail in the coffin, which shows it wasn't working class anxiety, because in America, you can't talk about class without talking about race. It was racism, it was racial resentment, and it was a concept we know as hostile sexism. This belief that men, in particular white men, should always be dominant, and this anxiety and hostility towards women who were perceived as breaking rules of tradition, i.e. being too independent, like Hillary Clinton. And I think the narrative persists because you have so many in the chattering class and many liberals and progressives who are not in the chattering class, who are not part of the mainstream corporate media, who don't write about these topics for a living, who are beholden to this belief in human decency. And to basically say the fact that Trump's election was about racism and white backlash, and you had a overt, at this point, racist in Donald Trump and everybody around him basically telling angry white folks that we're going to put you back on top. And that black guy who was president, we're going to have a corrective. Make America great again really means make America white again. And that's why Trump won.
Yeah. So, I mean, so the glib response to that has been, how do you explain people who vote for a black president and then turn around and vote for Donald Trump, out of racism? What is the response to that type of critique of the narrative that Donald Trump won because he activated some type of racism in folks?
Well, there are very few Obama to Trump voters. We know that empirically from exit polls. And the simple response would be that a lot of these racially resentful white and not just men, women, female voters voted for Trump. Rather, they voted for Obama despite the fact he was black. Right. So we can actually go back and look at the polling data. Obama's race, the color of his skin, actually cost him about 4 to 5 percentage points. Obama certainly was extremely competent, one of, I would suggest, best presidents in recent memory. But if you look at the economy, if you look at the disaster that was the Bush presidency, you had white working class voters, quote unquote, in these areas basically saying, you know what, I am not too fond of black and brown folk. And I'm going to vote for Obama despite the fact that he's black. So then you have Trump come along, who doesn't use dog whistles. He uses racial air raid sirens to basically speak to those voters and say, I will protect you. I will save you. We have black and brown folks coming from Latin and South America who are rapists and murderers. I'm going to put white men like you, never mind the fact that he's a billionaire, supposedly, I'm going to put you on top. And here's something else to think about. We just had some new data about these Trump voters who supported Bernie Sanders. So you had a lot of these Trump voters in these areas who voted for Bernie in the primaries. And guess who they voted for when they had a choice between Hillary and Trump? They voted for Trump. So even their support even their support for Bernie was a protest vote of sorts. So the evidence, again, suggests that it was race and racial resentment and not, quote unquote, working class anxiety. But that story is so compelling and it's so easy and it's low hanging fruit.
Well, now, we should say, in fairness, that the defectors from Sanders, at least in the context of the Democratic Party, to Donald Trump, was at least, based on studies by Washington Post, lower than we've seen, let's say, in the 2000 race from folks who voted for Clinton and voted for Obama. Nevertheless, I think that one of the things that we also know from research, and I don't know if, how much folks are familiar with this book by John Sides and Michael Tesler and Lynn Vavrick about what Barack Obama did to the electorate in terms of making them aware of where the relative parties were on race. I mean, one of the things that came out of that book that I found stunning was data that showed that it wasn't until Barack Obama's election that white working folk without a college education, 50% of them thought that the Republican Party was to the left of the Democrats when it came to race. And it took an African-American president to be elected for these folks to realize, like, wait a second, the Democrats seem to be more supportive of people of color in this country. And that turns out to be problematic. I mean, so what Barack Obama did in many respects was just by the fact of being a black president was to racialize a lot of things that hadn't been racialized at that point. And you can see that graph, go through Mitt Romney, who, of course, was no champion of the working class, right? I mean, that's one of the things that people don't consider, that Mitt Romney, that the vast majority of people who voted for Donald Trump, I mean, we're talking in the 90s, also voted for Mitt Romney. Not exactly the working man's hero. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Chauncey, let's dig more into this and what it says about who should we should be looking at if we're interested in who has a better chance of winning in a general election. Once we have the knowledge that there's a significant portion of the American electorate who is somewhat racist and somewhat misogynist. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Sam Seder, Ring of Fire Radio.